The morning of February 16, 1945, arrived over the western Pacific with the kind of crystal clarity that made naval gunnery both precise and devastating. Seaman First Class Robert Morrison stood at his battle station aboard the battleship USS Tennessee, watching through the armored glass of Turret 2 as the most powerful naval armada in human history took position off the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. Behind him, the 14-inch guns of his turret were loaded with 1,400-pound armor-piercing shells, each projectile capable of penetrating 30 feet of reinforced concrete or reducing a city block to rubble with a single impact. The Tennessee was just one of 8 battleships in Task Force 54, but together they represented more concentrated firepower than had ever been assembled against a single 8-square-mile target in the history of warfare. Morrison had served aboard the Tennessee since her reconstruction following the Pearl Harbor attack, participating in every major Pacific operation from the Marshall Islands to the Philippines. The 22-year-old gunner from Ohio had learned his trade during 2 years of continuous combat, mastering the complex systems that enabled a World War I-era battleship to deliver accurate fire at ranges exceeding 20 miles. The Tennessee's main battery consisted of 12 14-inch/50 caliber guns mounted in 4 triple turrets, each weapon capable of hurling its massive projectiles across distances that would have been unimaginable to naval gunners of previous generations. The ship's fire control systems incorporated radar technology and ballistic computers that enabled accuracy levels approaching those of land-based artillery, transforming naval gunfire from area bombardment to precision destruction. Admiral William Blandy commanded Task Force 54 from his flagship USS Estes, coordinating the naval bombardment that would support the Marine landing scheduled for February 19. Blandy was a veteran of the European theater who had transferred to the Pacific to apply lessons learned during the Normandy invasion to amphibious operations against Japanese-held islands. His task force represented the culmination of 4 years of naval construction and technological development, consisting of 8 battleships, 18 cruisers, 43 destroyers, and 11 escort carriers. The combined fleet displaced more than 800,000 tons and carried sufficient ammunition to level cities. But their target was a volcanic island measuring just 8 square miles and defended by an estimated 21,000 Japanese troops. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima extended far beyond its modest geographic dimensions. The island sat 660 miles south of Tokyo and 625 miles north of Saipan, positioned to provide early warning of B-29 formations approaching the Japanese home islands from American bases in the Mariana Islands. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima's 2 operational airfields were intercepting bomber formations with increasing effectiveness, inflicting casualties that threatened the sustainability of the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industrial targets. Admiral Chester Nimitz had calculated that capturing Iwo Jima would reduce B-29 losses by 40% while providing an emergency landing strip for damaged bombers returning from missions over Japan. The mathematics were compelling but stark. American forces would have to neutralize the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific through the application of overwhelming firepower followed by direct assault. Captain Russell Berkey commanded the USS Washington during the Iwo Jima operation, directing his ship's 9 16-inch guns against suspected Japanese positions with the methodical precision that characterized American naval gunnery in 1945. Each 16-inch shell weighed 2,700 pounds and could penetrate up to 30 feet of reinforced concrete, but intelligence reports indicated that Japanese defenses had been constructed specifically to resist naval bombardment. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi had spent 8 months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress, ordering the construction of 11 miles of interconnected tunnel, 5,000 cave positions, and 800 pillboxes carved from volcanic rock and reinforced with steel and concrete. The defensive system was designed to survive preliminary bombardment and inflict maximum casualties on American assault forces through concentrated defensive fire from concealed positions. The first salvo of the naval bombardment exploded against Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches at 0640 hours on February 16, when the USS Tennessee opened fire with her main battery at a range of 16,000 yards. The massive shells created explosions that sent volcanic sand and pulverized rock hundreds of feet into the air, while the concussion from the impacts registered on seismographs in Hawaii, 3,500 miles distant. Within minutes, 7 other battleships had joined the bombardment, their combined firepower representing more than 100 major caliber guns capable of delivering shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds. The sound of the naval bombardment was audible more than 50 miles away, and pilots flying combat air patrol reported that the explosions created a dust cloud that rose to 10,000 feet above the island. Gunners Mate Second-Class Tommy Williams operated the loading mechanism for the USS Missouri's 16-inch turret 1, coordinating the complex sequence of operations that enabled the massive guns to fire every 90 seconds. Williams was 19 years old and had joined the Navy directly from high school in Kansas, learning his trade during the ship's workup period before deploying to the Pacific. Each 16-inch projectile required a crew of 16 men to load and fire, with powder charges totaling 660 pounds of smokeless propellant that generated chamber pressures exceeding 36,000 pounds per square inch. The Missouri's main battery could deliver a full 9-gun salvo every 2 minutes, each broadside representing 24,300 pounds of high explosive delivered with accuracy that enabled individual targets to be engaged at ranges exceeding 20 miles. The technological sophistication of American naval gunnery systems in 1945 represented the culmination of decades of research and development in ballistic computers, radar fire control, and precision manufacturing. The Mark 8 fire control radar aboard the USS Iowa could track targets at ranges up to 50,000 yards while providing continuous range, bearing, and target motion data to ballistic computers that calculated firing solutions in real time. The Mark 1A fire control computer aboard each battleship incorporated mechanical analog systems that could solve complex ballistic equations while compensating for wind, temperature, barometric pressure, and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. These technological advances enabled American battleships to engage targets with accuracy levels that approached those of land-based artillery, transforming naval gunfire from area bombardment to precision destruction. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson served as gunnery officer aboard the USS North Carolina, coordinating the ship's 16-inch main battery with the sophisticated fire control systems that enabled accurate shooting at extreme ranges. Patterson was a graduate of the Naval Academy who had specialized in gunnery throughout his career, participating in the development of radar fire control systems that revolutionized naval warfare during World War II. His ship's Mark 8 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously while providing firing data to ballistic computers that calculated optimal firing solutions for each gun. The North Carolina's main battery fired 348 rounds during the 3-day bombardment of Iwo Jima, each shot precisely plotted and coordinated with spotting aircraft that observed the fall of shot and provided corrections for subsequent salvos. The Japanese defensive preparations on Iwo Jima reflected the tactical genius of Lieutenant General Kurabayashi, who understood that traditional beach defenses would be obliterated by American naval gunfire. Instead of attempting to contest the landing at the water's edge, Kurabayashi ordered the construction of defense in depth, with mutually supporting positions that could provide continuous coverage of American advance routes while remaining concealed from naval observation. The defensive network included artillery positions capable of engaging ships offshore, but these weapons were positioned in caves that could be sealed during bombardment and opened when targets presented themselves. More critically, the cave system that honeycombed the island enabled Japanese forces to survive prolonged bombardment, while maintaining the capability to resist American ground forces with concentrated defensive fire. The scale of American firepower concentrated against Iwo Jima was unprecedented in naval history. The 8 battleships of Task Force 54 carried a combined total of 66 major caliber guns, ranging from the Tennessee's 14-inch weapons to the Iowa's 16-inch rifles. During the 3-day bombardment, these ships fired more than 14,000 rounds of major caliber ammunition, delivering approximately 38,000 tons of high explosive against Japanese positions. By comparison, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany averaged approximately 50 tons per square mile across the entire country. The firepower density achieved at Iwo Jima exceeded 4,000 tons per square mile, demonstrating America's capacity to concentrate overwhelming force against specific strategic objectives. Fire Controlman First Class Michael O'Sullivan operated the Mark 8 radar aboard the USS Alabama, tracking Japanese positions and providing targeting data for the ship's 16-inch guns. O'Sullivan had been trained in the operation of sophisticated electronic systems that represented the cutting edge of 1940s technology, incorporating vacuum tubes, mechanical computers, and precision optics that enabled accurate naval gunnery at previously impossible ranges. His radar could detect targets as small as individual buildings at ranges up to 25 miles, while providing continuous tracking data that enabled the ship's guns to engage moving targets with devastating accuracy. The Alabama fired 552 rounds from her main battery during the Iwo Jima bombardment, with O'Sullivan's fire control systems guiding each shot toward suspected Japanese positions. The coordination between naval gunfire and carrier-based aviation represented a masterpiece of modern military planning, with bombing missions carefully timed to avoid interference with naval gunfire while maximizing the cumulative effect of both forms of bombardment. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, provided air support with 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers carrying a combined total of more than 1,200 aircraft. The carrier air groups conducted continuous strikes against Iwo Jima throughout the bombardment period, delivering an additional 6,800 tons of bombs and rockets against Japanese positions. The coordination between air and naval forces required precise timing and sophisticated communication systems that enabled real-time coordination between ships, aircraft, and ground spotters. Lieutenant Commander John Smith commanded VB-83, a dive bomber squadron flying Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers from the carrier USS Essex during the pre-invasion bombardment. Smith's squadron carried 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate cave entrances and destroy underground installations that naval gunfire could not reach. The Helldiver was specifically designed for precision bombing against hardened targets, incorporating dive breaks that enabled accurate delivery of ordnance against small targets, while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Smith's pilots had extensive experience in close air support operations, but the fortified nature of Iwo Jima's defenses presented unique challenges that differed from previous Pacific operations. Japanese positions were so thoroughly camouflaged and protected that pilots often had difficulty identifying targets even after multiple reconnaissance flights. The psychological impact of the bombardment extended beyond its physical effects, serving notice to Japanese defenders that they faced an enemy with unprecedented capacity to deliver concentrated firepower. The continuous thunder of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment created a psychological environment that would have broken the morale of most military forces, but Japanese troops on Iwo Jima had been specifically selected and trained for this type of defensive operation. General Kurabayashi had instituted a program of psychological preparation that emphasized duty to the emperor and acceptance of death as the ultimate expression of Japanese military virtue. The bombardment that was intended to demoralize Japanese defenders instead confirmed their expectation of fighting to the death against overwhelming American firepower. Bosun's mate First Class Robert Anderson served aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis during the Iwo Jima bombardment, operating the 8-inch guns that provided supporting fire for the battleship bombardment. Anderson was a veteran of Pacific operations dating back to the Guadalcanal campaign, and his experience with naval gunnery enabled him to recognize that the Iwo Jima bombardment was qualitatively different from previous Pacific operations. The duration and intensity of the fire exceeded anything he had witnessed during 2 years of combat, but reconnaissance flights consistently reported that Japanese positions appeared to remain operational despite the unprecedented weight of ordnance being delivered against them. Anderson's gun crew fired more than 800 rounds during the 3-day bombardment, but post-mission analysis would reveal that the naval gunfire had minimal effect on the underground defensive network that would dominate the subsequent ground combat. The technological limitations of 1945 naval gunnery became apparent as the bombardment progressed and intelligence reports indicated that Japanese defensive capabilities remained largely intact. Naval shells, regardless of their size and explosive power, could not penetrate the volcanic rock and reinforced concrete that protected Japanese positions. The trajectory of naval gunfire made it particularly ineffective against cave entrances that had been positioned to minimize exposure to plunging fire from ships offshore. Even the massive 16-inch shells of the Iowa-class battleships could not collapse the tunnel systems that connected Japanese defensive positions, as the explosive effects were dissipated by the volcanic rock that absorbed much of the blast energy. Chief Petty Officer William Murphy commanded the forward 16-inch turret aboard the USS Wisconsin, coordinating the complex loading and firing procedures that enabled the massive guns to maintain sustained fire throughout the bombardment. Murphy was a 20-year Navy veteran who had served on battleships since before the war, witnessing the evolution of naval gunnery from the primitive systems of the 1920s to the sophisticated fire control technology of 1945. His turret crew consisted of 68 highly trained specialists whose coordinated efforts enabled the three 16-inch guns to fire every 90 seconds for hours at a time. The Wisconsin's main battery expended 384 rounds during the Iwo Jima bombardment, each shot representing the culmination of decades of technological development and tactical innovation. The logistics of sustaining the naval bombardment required coordination between multiple service branches and represented one of the most complex supply operations in naval history. Each battleship carried approximately 1,200 rounds of major caliber ammunition, representing the ship's entire loadout for extended operations. The three-day bombardment of Iwo Jima consumed more than half of each ship's ammunition supply, requiring careful coordination with ammunition ships that could replenish magazines while the bombardment continued. Additionally, the high rate of fire placed enormous stress on gun barrels and mechanical systems, requiring continuous maintenance by specialized personnel who worked throughout the bombardment to keep the weapons operational. Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Frank Rodriguez loaded 1,000-pound bombs aboard SB-2C Helldivers operating from the USS Lexington, preparing ordnance for precision strikes against Japanese cave positions that naval gunfire could not effectively engage. Rodriguez was responsible for fusing and arming bombs that would be delivered against targets just yards from American positions, requiring precision that exceeded peacetime training standards. The ordnance loading operation required coordination between aircraft mechanics, pilots, and deck personnel who worked under combat conditions to maintain the continuous airstrikes that supplemented naval gunfire throughout the bombardment period. Each aircraft sortie represented hours of preparation by ground personnel, whose technical expertise enabled carrier operations to continue despite the complex logistics of sustained combat operations. The Japanese response to the bombardment demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Lieutenant General Kurabayashi had built into his defensive plan. Rather than attempting to engage American ships directly, Japanese forces remained hidden in their underground positions, preserving their strength for the ground combat that would determine the ultimate outcome of the battle. The few Japanese artillery pieces that revealed their positions by firing at American ships were immediately destroyed by concentrated naval gunfire, confirming Kurabayashi's decision to avoid premature engagement with American forces. Japanese observers carefully plotted American ship positions and firing patterns, gathering intelligence that would enable defensive fire to be directed against landing forces when the amphibious assault began. The morning of February 19th brought the culmination of the most intensive naval bombardment in Pacific War history as Task Force 54 prepared to support the Marine landing with direct fire against beach defenses. At 0640 hours, all 8 battleships opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of explosions along Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches that was visible from ships positioned 20 miles offshore. The coordinated broadside represented more than 50,000 pounds of high explosive delivered in a single volley, creating a psychological and physical impact that exceeded anything previously attempted in amphibious warfare. The sound of the simultaneous firing was audible in Hawaii, and the concussion from the explosions created seismic tremors that registered on instruments throughout the Pacific Basin. Seaman Morrison felt the USS Tennessee shudder as her 12 14-inch guns fired simultaneously, their muzzle blast creating pressure waves that could kill exposed personnel at close range, while the 1,400-pound projectiles arced toward their targets at velocities exceeding 2,500 feet per second. Morrison had participated in dozens of naval bombardments during 2 years of Pacific combat, but the intensity and coordination of the Iwo Jima fire exceeded anything he had previously experienced. The continuous thunder of major caliber guns created a sound environment that made verbal communication impossible, while the muzzle flashes from 8 battleships firing simultaneously created a strobe effect that was visible for hundreds of miles across the Pacific. The tactical coordination required for the bombardment represented the pinnacle of naval staff work and communication technology. Fire control officers aboard each ship maintained continuous communication with aircraft spotters, shore fire control parties, and other vessels to ensure that firing patterns did not interfere with friendly forces while maximizing the destructive effect against Japanese positions. The battleship USS Maryland maintained a plotting room where officers tracked the fall of shot from all ships in the task force, coordinating fires to prevent overlap while ensuring comprehensive coverage of suspected enemy positions. This level of coordination required communication systems and plotting techniques that had been developed specifically for the complex requirements of amphibious warfare. The psychological impact on American forces was as significant as the effect on Japanese defenders, as sailors and Marines witnessed a demonstration of American industrial and technological capability that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Corporal James Bradley of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division watched the bombardment from his transport ship, observing explosions that transformed the landscape of Iwo Jima while preparing for his role as a Navy hospital corpsman attached to Marine assault forces. The young medic understood that he would soon be treating casualties among Marines who were relying on the bombardment to neutralize Japanese defensive capabilities. But the scale of destruction being visited upon the island created confidence that resistance would be minimal once the landing began. The failure of the bombardment to achieve its intended effects became apparent within minutes of the Marine landing as Japanese artillery and mortar fire began falling among the assault forces with accuracy that indicated extensive preparation and reconnaissance. The 3 days of naval gunfire had destroyed surface installations and eliminated many of the obvious defensive positions. But the core of Japanese defensive strength remained operational in underground positions that had been specifically designed to survive bombardment. Lieutenant General Kurabayashi's tactical plan had anticipated exactly this scenario, and his forces were prepared to emerge from their concealed positions to engage American forces at the moment when casualties would be most devastating to the success of the operation. The strategic lessons of the Iwo Jima bombardment would influence American military planning for the remainder of World War II and beyond, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of technological solutions to military problems. The concentration of firepower achieved by Task Force 54 was unprecedented in naval history, but it had failed to eliminate the need for ground forces willing to engage determined enemies in close combat. The 14,000 rounds of major-caliber naval ammunition and 6,800 tons of aerial ordnance delivered against Iwo Jima represented the most intensive bombardment per square mile in military history, but they could not substitute for the careful application of infantry tactics and the acceptance of heavy casualties among assault forces. Captain Berkey's assessment of the bombardment's effectiveness, delivered to Admiral Blandy on the evening of February 19, was characteristically direct. The USS Washington had expended 372 rounds from her main battery during the 3-day bombardment, each shot precisely plotted and observed by aircraft spotters. Despite this unprecedented application of firepower, Japanese resistance during the Marine landing had been immediate and effective, indicating that the underground defensive system remained largely operational. Berkey's experience with naval gunfire in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters had taught him that no bombardment, regardless of its intensity, could eliminate well-constructed defensive positions that had been designed specifically to survive such attacks. The human cost of the bombardment's failure became apparent during the first day of the Marine landing as casualties mounted at rates that exceeded the bloodiest Pacific operations. By evening on February 19, Marine forces had sustained more than 2,400 casualties, including 500 killed in action, despite the unprecedented support provided by naval gunfire and carrier aviation. The casualty rates represented a devastating blow to units that had trained together for months and had developed the tactical cohesion necessary for successful amphibious operations. Each casualty reduced not just numerical strength but also the collective experience and leadership that enabled Marine units to function effectively under combat conditions. Gunner's Mate Williams continued loading 16-inch shells aboard the USS Missouri throughout the first week of the ground campaign, providing fire support for Marine forces as they advanced yard by yard across Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain. The naval gunfire support mission required different techniques than the pre-invasion bombardment, with individual targets being engaged at the request of shorefire control parties who could observe Japanese positions and direct accurate fire against specific threats. Williams and his crew fired more than 200 additional rounds during the first week of the ground campaign, each shot carefully coordinated to avoid friendly casualties while providing maximum support for Marine infantry advancing against prepared defensive positions. The technological sophistication of American fire support systems enabled unprecedented coordination between naval gunfire, artillery, and close air support throughout the Iwo Jima campaign. Shore-fire control parties equipped with radio systems could request naval gunfire against specific targets within minutes of identifying Japanese positions, while aircraft controllers coordinated bombing and strafing runs to support Marine advances. The integration of these different fire support systems represented a level of tactical coordination that had been impossible during earlier Pacific operations, But even this technological advantage could not eliminate the fundamental requirement for infantry forces to close with and destroy enemy positions through direct assault. The final phase of the naval bombardment came on March 26, 1945, when Iwo Jima was declared secure after 36 days of continuous combat. Task Force 54 had expended more than 20,000 rounds of major caliber ammunition during the campaign, representing the largest expenditure of naval gunfire in Pacific War history. The ships had demonstrated their capacity to maintain sustained fire support operations for extended periods while adapting their tactics to support ground forces engaged in close-quarters combat. However, the failure of the preliminary bombardment to neutralize Japanese defensive capabilities had resulted in casualty rates that exceeded those of any previous Pacific operation, confirming that technological superiority could not substitute for tactical competence and strategic wisdom. Seaman Morrison survived the Iwo Jima campaign and returned with the USS Tennessee to the United States for overhaul and preparation for the planned invasion of Japan. The young gunner carried with him the knowledge that he had participated in the most intensive naval bombardment in history, but he also understood that the massive application of firepower had failed to prevent the deaths of nearly 7,000 Marines during the subsequent ground campaign. Years later, Morrison would reflect that the bombardment had created a false sense of security among American forces, leading to tactical assumptions that proved tragically incorrect when tested against determined defenders in prepared positions. The legacy of Task Force 54's performance at Iwo Jima would influence American naval doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond, demonstrating the continued importance of naval gunfire support while highlighting the limitations of conventional weapons against deeply fortified positions. The 880 warships that participated in the campaign had represented the pinnacle of American naval power, but their failure to eliminate Japanese defensive capabilities had forced a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between firepower and tactical success. The lessons learned during the 74-day bombing campaign and 3-day naval bombardment would inform American military planning for future conflicts, emphasizing the need for realistic assessment of enemy capabilities rather than reliance on technological superiority alone. The morning of August 15, 1945, brought news of Japan's surrender to the crews of Task Force 54 as they prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had achieved what conventional bombardment could not, forcing Japanese surrender without the massive casualties that would have resulted from amphibious assault against prepared defenses. Seaman Morrison and thousands of other naval personnel who had witnessed the failure of conventional weapons at Iwo Jima understood that they had participated in the last great naval bombardment of World War II, and perhaps of history itself. The technological evolution that had enabled 880 warships to concentrate unprecedented firepower against a single target had also produced weapons that made such massive conventional operations obsolete. The statistical summary of American firepower applied against Iwo Jima confirmed that the campaign had represented the most intensive application of conventional military force in history. The combined weight of naval shells and aerial bombs delivered against the 8-square-mile island exceeded 45,000 tons, equivalent to more than 5,600 tons per square mile. The 20,000 rounds of major-caliber naval ammunition represented the entire production capacity of American munitions factories for more than 2 months, while the 880 warships that participated in the operation constituted the largest naval force ever assembled for a single campaign. Despite this unprecedented application of firepower, Japanese defensive capabilities had remained largely intact, forcing American ground forces to reduce each defensive position through close combat that resulted in casualty rates exceeding those of European operations. The strategic implications of the Iwo Jima bombardment extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Pacific. American military planners had assumed that the combination of strategic bombing and naval gunfire could reduce enemy defensive capabilities to manageable levels, enabling amphibious forces to seize objectives with acceptable casualties. The reality of combat on Iwo Jima demonstrated that defensive techniques had evolved to counter technological advantages, creating situations where firepower superiority could not substitute for tactical competence and strategic wisdom. The lessons learned during the campaign would influence American military doctrine for decades, contributing to the development of new weapon systems and tactical approaches that acknowledged the limitations of conventional bombardment against determined defenders in prepared positions. The human dimension of the bombardment's failure was measured not just in American casualties, but in the psychological impact on personnel who had witnessed the limits of technological solutions to military problems. Captain Berkey and thousands of other naval officers who had participated in the operation carried with them the knowledge that massive firepower applications could not guarantee tactical success against well-prepared enemies. The experience would influence their approach to future conflicts, emphasizing the continued importance of tactical intelligence, strategic planning, and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities, rather than reliance on technological superiority alone. The final assessment of Task Force 54's performance at Iwo Jima confirmed that American naval forces had achieved new levels of technological sophistication and firepower concentration, while demonstrating the continued relevance of human factors in determining military outcomes. The 880 warships and 1,200 aircraft that had participated in the campaign represented the most advanced military technology available to any nation in 1945, but their effectiveness had been limited by the tactical intelligence and defensive preparation of Japanese forces. The balance between technology and tactics that had characterized the Iwo Jima campaign would remain relevant throughout the subsequent history of warfare, reminding military planners that firepower could support but not replace the fundamental requirements of strategic wisdom and tactical competence in the conduct of military operations.